We're the two teachers.
Where school is always in session.
Today we're looking at the Bill of Rights. Andy, could there be anything more central to our individual liberties than the enumerated first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights?
The Bill of Rights, and particularly during this time of governmental, economic, social turmoil, along with COVID-19, it's going to be so interesting, Dan, to see what cases come out, what legal cases come out of this, because there are going to be many legal cases, and particularly those cases that apply to our Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment.
Well, when we look at the Bill of Rights, invariably we look at how the courts have interpreted them. What they said on paper in 1791 may not exactly be what they mean in 2020. So let's take a look. In fact, Andy, I think the First Amendment ones are the most interesting. It is our preferred position. So let's just take a look at free speech, for instance, that case we always talk about, Schenck versus the United States.
Well, in Schenck, it was during World War I, a time of turmoil, when a political activist was encouraging men not to enter the draft. And the U.S. government tried to, or did, punish him and restricted his speech. And the Supreme Court upheld that punishment. They said that in that case, during a time of war, the federal government could shut down and punish Schenck's speech. And that's where you get the idea where Oliver Wendell Holmes said in Schenck that the government can punish you if you falsely shout fire in a crowded theater because of the danger that it could create.
Well, that clear and present danger test may not be appropriately used today, but it does remind us that free speech is limited, that the courts have recognized that there are instances where we don't have freedom of speech.
But already you're seeing, but Dan, you're already seeing pressure from newspapers and journalists who are trying to track down local COVID cases that might be tracked down to, let's say, a nursing home, for instance. And does that local government, do those local law enforcement or healthcare workers, do they have to reveal the name of that nursing home? And so you're already seeing this tension between the right to free press or the right to free speech and publishing information versus government trying to hold on to some of that information.
Well, speaking of tension, let's look at students. Do students leave their rights at the schoolhouse gate? And of course, we always talk about the Tinker case and the black armbands.
Well, the Tinker case, again, during the Vietnam War and the Tinker family protesting U.S. government policies in Vietnam with symbolic speech. And again, the school punished their speech, but unlike Schenck, the Supreme Court in this case said that the students' right to free speech was protected, that a school couldn't just punish or prohibit speech just because it was politically sensitive or offensive. Although we know that in later school speech cases, that school administrators are given wide discretion to be able to determine if student speech is disruptive to the educational mission of a school, even speech that's out of school. So it'll be really interesting in terms of as more and more schools go to e-learning.
Yes.
Could that social media post that's posted during an e-learning school day, would that be considered free speech by a student, or would courts determine that that's in-school speech that could somehow be restricted or punished? Some really interesting hypothetical possibilities here with civil liberties.
Well, speaking of hypotheticals, you talked about the press, and freedom of the press is certainly going to be tested in this crisis. And we go back to that New York Times versus the United States case where the court seemingly was willing to say, you know, we can prohibit some press if it deals with national security. And as much as we talk about COVID-19 as a warlike scenario, will we see the government cutting down on some of the articles that will come out that will be highly negative in the weeks to come?
And absolutely. And as I kind of said before, remember, the right to free press is not just the right to publish information. It's also the press's right or citizens' right to access information in methods like the Freedom of Information Acts or Open Meeting Acts. And so as governments are trying to respond to the crisis with emergency meetings and in some cases kind of virtual meetings for some levels of government, there'll be a lot of questions from the press in terms of what kind of access should we as the press or we as citizens have to these meetings or to this information that government has access to, and in some cases is trying to restrict our access.
Andy, let's turn to the religion clauses, because this really hits home as we see a lot of churches and places of worship closed in this crisis. People are wondering about their religious rights. And also when Trump talks about, or government officials talk about certain holidays and their importance, we know we have the Establishment Clause of religion, and the courts have been pretty clear in our lifetime defining what that means. An establishment means that the government of the United States cannot show preference to one religion over another. But that case Engel is really the landmark case for us.
It's a landmark case when it came to public schools requiring students to read Bible verses at the beginning of a school day, and the Supreme Court said no, that ended up violating the Establishment Clause because it becomes government promoting religion. And of course, we have the Yoder case, which is about the free exercise of religion. And did that Amish family in Wisconsin, did they have to comply with state standards at the time, requiring them to send their children to a school, a public school in that case, through high school? Or could that Amish family decline that on the premise of their free exercise rights? And in that case, the Supreme Court said, yes, the Yoder family did have the free exercise right to religion to not send their kids to a public school.
Andy, when we talk about the Bill of Rights, we invariably talk about how powerful the courts are. And in some cases, the courts recognize rights that aren't even enumerated in the Bill of Rights, like privacy. The Roe v. Wade case dealing with abortion and a woman's right to choose, that word privacy is now a sacred individual right, even though it's not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Andy, we're going to hear a lot more from the courts, and there'll be some landmark cases coming out of this crisis, and it's something we're going to have to talk about.
Well, you're going to definitely have questions about privacy of healthcare information in times of a time when public governments are trying to tackle healthcare. How far does privacy rights go with that? And in terms of civil liberties, let's not forget the right to assemble. And that certainly falls in with religious groups that are still trying to go against stay-at-home orders in particular states. Will they file civil liberties claims claiming that the government is infringing on their right to assemble or their right to be a religious group gathering? And, in terms of what leeway will government be given to restrict some of those rights? Because we know the Bill of Rights is not absolute. And as you said before, the Supreme Court and our courts have commonly, in different times of turmoil, allowed government different restrictions that maybe eat away at some of our liberties in the Bill of Rights.
Ooh, Andy, we're the two teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.